So, welcome to the Black Archive Safer at Home virtual series. My name is Louis Berthen. I am the assistant archivist, and today we're going to be doing my segment, which is called Legacies, Profiles, and Greatness, and we're going to be talking about the judge, Lawson Edward Thomas. Hi, Ruth Madison. Thank you for joining. So, just for the people who've joined in, this is a photo of Lawson Edward Thomas. And let's get started. So, Ellie Thomas, as he was otherwise known, is hailed as the first black judge in the South since Reconstruction. As the judge of the Black Police Precinct and Municipal Court, he presided over the cases that were brought to the court by the city's black policemen. He was a civil rights leader and an activist leading many moments and movements here in Miami. So, Ellie Thomas was born in Ocala, Florida on January 28th of 1898 to Robert J. Thomas and Hattie Butler Thomas. Ellie Thomas was the eldest son, and according to a 1955 article, they grew up poor. His father was actually a phosphate miner, and he passed on while Ellie Thomas was a young man. So this left him as a role model for his younger brothers, Maxwell and Robert. So he attended FAMC, getting his undergraduate degree there, and then attending the University of Michigan for his law degree. It's actually said that while he was on his way to the University of Michigan, he switched his majors between medicine and law. So good thing for us that he did. While I don't have exact dates for the time that he earned these two degrees, it seems that he was in Michigan in 1926 because this is actually the year he married Evelyn Hutchison in Detroit. So after that, he moved back to Florida in 1926, but he didn't actually come down to Miami until 1935 when he opened his practice here. So for context, Miami at the time, and I would assume for most courts in the South, they actually did not allow black attorneys to present their own cases. They would do the legal briefs, and if they had to go to court, they would hire a white attorney to present the case for them. Thomas, however, dared to challenge these norms. He arrived to the municipal court, and the bailiff actually threatened to throw him out the 6th floor window. So let me read to you from that experience. So, hi everyone who's just joined in, Ninahim and Amara. So we're talking about Lawson Edward Thomas. So I'm going to read to you from his experience when he went to go present his first case at the municipal court. So Thomas made his first court appearance in Miami's municipal court. 40 or so blacks sat in the rear, the place that was reserved for blacks. Thomas slipped into a seat at the front of the courtroom. "I don't care who you are," the white bailiff roared. "You go back and sit down with the rest of the N-word." Thomas, an attorney, refused, and Miami's only other black lawyer stayed out of the court. Thomas says he either handled legal matters that didn't require court appearance, or he hired a white lawyer to present the case for him. The president of the local bar association had actually advised Thomas to do the same shortly after he arrived in Miami in 1935, but Thomas refused this advice. So when the bailiff threatened to throw Thomas through the 6th floor window, Thomas waited in the hallway. And when the judge, James E. Dunn, took the bench, Thomas scored a double victory. He won the case for his clients and a seat at the front of the courtroom. Under Florida law, Dunn informed the bailiff Thomas was entitled to sit where he pleased. Says Thomas, "I'm not able to forget it till my dying days." And later of the same encounter, Thomas said, "I had little brushes, but that's what pioneering is, cutting down trees, and I was going to make it work." And hi to everyone who just joined in. Hi Alicia, hi Miss Brannon, hi Swamp Maid. I'm talking about Lawson Edward Thomas. Here's a photo. So while he was an attorney, some of the most important cases that he tried was actually one where he represented the parents of black children who attended school in Broward County. He sued the Broward County School Board because of the unequal treatment of black children. The school year for black children was 3 months shorter because they were needed as a labor source for bean field harvesting. They were forced to do this. So he was also instrumental in a case that eventually secured equal salaries for white and black school teachers that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. He also fought for the rights of blacks to serve on juries here in Dade County in 1950, and so that the U.S. Constitution would actually live up to its promise of a person being judged by a jury of their peers. Let me read to you from an article here. So he was a fighter for civil rights, often conferring with Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, then a lawyer for the NAACP, on cases he thought the organization should look into. In the late 1940s, Thomas was the attorney for a group of black parents in Broward County who sued the school board because the school year for black children was 3 months shorter than for white children. Black schools were closed earlier so that children could be available to work in the bean fields. He told the judge, "It's amazing that the school board thinks that black children are smart enough to learn in 6 months what it takes 9 months for white children to learn." Thomas won the case. The Broward County Commissioner, Sylvia Poitier, remembers the judge and the suit. "It was in 1947, she said. I was in the 7th grade at the time and I was a victim. I used to have to quit school and go to work for Emory and the Alvin Jones bean farm. Black children in Broward County didn't get the opportunity to attend school a full 9 months until 1949, after Ellie Thomas won the suit." So let's continue. He was also one of the organizers behind the Haulover Beach Wade-In protest. This moment is seen by many as the start of the civil rights movement here in Miami. When the protesters entered the water, the sheriff told them to get out. Thomas challenged him and asked if he was going to arrest them. So supposedly the deputy sheriff only stammered and didn't do anything. So they stayed in the water and no arrests were made that day. And shortly thereafter, County Commissioner Charles Crandon called Thomas to come down and, quote, "We'll figure something out." This directly led to the Virginia Key Beach being designated a colored beach in 1945. Before this, there was no place that blacks could go to bathe at the beach. The only time before this that they could was when D.A. Dorsey had purchased Fisher Island in 1918. Interestingly, the only way to arrive at Virginia Key was through a ferry until the Rickenbacker Causeway was completed in 1947. Thomas said to the black community of Virginia Key, "We got the prettiest beach. You look ahead and there's nothing to block you. It's just God's water." So a couple weeks ago, you'll remember that I was talking about Ira Davis, and my colleague had also talked about Ira Davis and talked about the Black Police Precinct. So if you remember, the first 5 were inducted in front of Ira Davis's dentist office, and the Black Police Precinct was opened in 1950. So this building is the only one of its kind in the nation. There is no other location that was a police precinct, a municipal court, and a jail all in one. When it was opened, Ellie Thomas was unanimously appointed to the bench. So this made him the first black judge in Miami. So the court only tried cases that were brought in by the black police officers, and they were not able to try any whites in any cases. Obviously, this is not because whites didn't commit any crimes. This is because the black officers were not able to stop the whites in any circumstances. And Ms. Brandon, I was actually going to say, I had seen your name in this article and you talking about that experience. So I'm glad that you said that. So I'll continue. Some people thought the establishment of the Black Police Precinct and Municipal Court would be seen as a move that would further perpetuate racial segregation here in Miami. But the Miami Times was behind this move 100%, so I'm going to read you an excerpt here. The Miami Times believe the choice is a good one. Some believe that setting up a court at this precinct is just another Jim Crow movement, accepting segregation while at the same time we are fighting against it. However, we do say that just as long as our schools are segregated and our churches are segregated, we are willing to go along with this court, believing that the appointment of a Negro judge and his staff is a step forward along the lines of progress. During his tenure, Thomas saw decreases in juvenile delinquency and general crime throughout the Central Negro District, and this was credited to the officers and the judge's work. Though it had great success, this court was dismantled in 1964 due to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So let me read you from these 2 articles here. So these are actually 2 stories that were told about how Judge Thomas conducted his court. So this is from Clyde Killings. So if you guys don't know who Clyde Killings was, he was an organizer. He owned some nightclubs here in Overtown, and he had planned for entertainment. He was the one who was actually responsible for bringing a lot of famous entertainers down to Overtown. So Clyde Killings, an Overtown resident since 1924, says Thomas was a tough judge. Killings remembers needing a knife to cut a decoration he was hanging in his Overtown nightclub. Not one of his 25 customers had one. They told him they weren't going to carry a knife in Thomas territory because he sentenced people to 10 or 20 days for carrying a switchblade as a concealed weapon. Says Killings, he was a man trying to straighten out the area. And hi KPZ, thank you for joining. And this is another one. This is Eugenia B. Thomas, who I'm going to talk about in just a second, was talking about her husband. He was dubbed 30-Day Thomas. because he handed out a 30-day sentence to anyone who came before him on a concealed weapon charge. You were bound to go to jail if you came before him on such a charge, Eugenia Thomas said. His feeling about violence was if you don't have a gun, nobody would get shot. And if you didn't have a knife, nobody would get cut. He'd pull his eyeglasses down over his nose, lean over the bench, and address the audience. Has anyone ever seen a knife get off a table and cut anyone? In 1951, in a Reader's Digest article about him, Thomas said, "That's one spot where I have a real advantage over the white court. If a white judge gave one of my people 30 days on a concealed weapon charge, he'd think he was being persecuted. But when I do it, he knows he's simply being punished." So I'll continue. So 3 years after the start of the Black Police Precinct and the municipal court, he married Eugenia B. Thomas, who was an incredible woman in her own right. She served as the first African American to become state PTA president from 1988 to 1990. And she also was named to Miami's Centennial Women's Hall of Fame. So obviously this was in 1996. She also has a K-8 school in Doral named after her. So Thomas was the president of the Negro Service Council. He was a member of the King of Clubs Association and was a founder of the Urban League of Greater Miami. And he also served as the chairman of Christian Hospital at one point. Being a pioneering judge for Dade County, he was honored by having the 11th Judicial Circuit Court named after him in the year 2000. So that's about 11 years after he had passed away. So I'm going to read to you from some articles that I found on him just so you can get a better idea of who he was and kind of his story. So this article is titled, The First Negro Judge in Dixie. Lawson Edward Thomas was one of the 6 brothers to a poor Negro couple in Ocala. He was the eldest, and while he was a young man, his father died, and Lawson became very much a father to his younger brothers. More than 30 years ago, he stood on the campus of the University of Michigan with $150 in his pocket. It was all cash, and the bundle represented several seasons of hard work and imposed thriftiness. This was his education money. That role was going to propel him into law school. It cost $80 to register, $40 for books, and the man had $30 left. That wasn't much fuel, but it got him started. His ability to cut lawns and wash windows in the well-to-do neighborhood near the university carried him the rest of the way. So he became a lawyer, practicing in Detroit for 6 years, then surrendering to the lure of his home, which was Florida. He went to Jacksonville for 2 years, and 20 years ago, he came on down to Miami, and he never left. These are merely the landmarks Lawson Thomas made on the road he took to become the first Negro judge in the South since Reconstruction days. The late Dr. O.P. Hart and Police Chief Walter Headley had felt all along that a high crime rate in Negro districts should be heard by a Negro judge. Negro police had proved beneficial. They understood the problem. Why wouldn't a judge accomplish the same thing? So on April 19th of 1950, Ellie Thomas was appointed the judge. From the beginning, his unique position was a touchy one. There were a few Negroes and white people who were more inclined to sarcasm than respect for a Negro judge. They had never seen a Negro judge before. So we'll continue. This is titled Not a Toy. One of them had an employee who got into trouble. Judge Thomas sentenced the employee to jail. The employer mumbled to a friend, "That man shouldn't be put in jail, especially by a Negro posing as a judge." The employer went to a city commissioner, and he learned then that Ellie Thomas was a judge, not a toy, and his decisions were just as valid as any other judge's decisions. Judge Thomas put into a jail a woman who had worked for some time as the maid in the house of a very influential person, and he stood hard by that decision. The only criticism of this man was that he was too strict, too firm, and it may be argued that he had to be. The only way to create respect for the Negro court was to act decisively and with no showing of uncertainty. So, in any event, in his time as a judge, he was so seldom overruled by a higher court that many people ceased to appeal his decisions. He quite likely has one of the finest records of any judge in Florida. Yes. And let's continue here. All right. And so this article was one in 1983. The Miami Herald had talked to him directly about his time. So I'll read to you. Thomas chuckles dryly as he remembers his challenges to a separate and unequal Miami. The 85-year-old is a living part of Dade County history, but his humor fades and his mood darkens when he turns his attention to the present. And again, this happened in 1983, but listen to it, and it's just, the saying that the history, it's today. Like, I think it holds true in many of these subjects that I've covered over the past couple of weeks. You listen to this, and it's not as if it's happening 50 years ago. It's still the same things that we're dealing with today. So, on the surface, Thomas says life appears to have changed for black lawyers, judges, and residents since the days of segregation. In reality, he says, the worlds of black and white Miamians are far apart. To white people, this is still over there. If it's not Miami, Thomas says, seated in his Overtown law office. I've been asked 10,000 times, how are you, Thomas, out there? By white lawyers and judges. That's their psychology. They don't mean anything by it. The city ignores Overtown's housing, employment, and economic needs, he says. Even though sporadic violence in the area didn't draw the undivided attention of Miami's powerful, he says. What was their concern? Thomas asks. He leans across his desk and spits out 3 words: the Orange Bowl. He is not impressed by the plans of the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Miami and others to pump several millions in dollars into Liberty City to open businesses in the black community. They wouldn't loan a black man $5,000 to open a shoe store on Flagler. The anger of Overtown residents after the shooting death of a young black man isn't attributable to one thing, he says. It's not unemployment. They had that in the Depression in 1929. It's not housing. It's racism. The only way to combat racism is just to keep trying to expose it. The city's neglect of Overtown is evidenced in the trash that doesn't get picked up, to the police officers who are insensitive to black citizens, Thomas says. It gets under your skin. It gets under my skin, he says, jabbing his finger in the air to underscore his frustration. Overtown is a special place to Thomas. It was his home until the 1960s, when the Interstate 95 cut through the neighborhood, wiping out Thomas's home. Every day he drives to Overtown to handle his small practice, mostly people referred by clients of 30 years ago. Money is not important. I never made much money, even when I was at my best, Thomas says. It's a habit. There's nothing to stay home for. If I feel like leaving at 3 p.m., I do. And so that pretty much covers Judge Ellie Thomas. I actually want to make a couple points here. So I'm going to reread to you from here. So Overtown is a special place to Thomas. It was his home until the 1960s, when the Interstate 95 cut through the neighborhood, wiping out Thomas's home. So for those who didn't know, the Interstate 95 was actually very planned. It was designed to cut through the Central Negro District to basically push the people who lived here out. And it did. It cut in about 20-year period from the end of the I-95 construction to, I think, 1970. The population of Overtown had decreased by half. And just because, for argument's sake, people are like, well, why didn't anyone fight against that? When the government claims eminent domain, it's actually one of the things that it's almost impossible to fight against. And these are just regular people who are trying to work and live their everyday lives. And this is not to go into any of the conditions of this housing, that there was already a multitude of problems with the complexes that were being built that were not being kept up, to the shotgun homes that already existed since the beginning of since the inception of Miami. So if Judge Ellie Thomas could not do anything about his house getting bulldozed by the I-95, how could anyone else do anything about it? And so there's that. And I'm going to show you a couple photos here. Give me a second. So we have here, so this is a photo of the first class of officers. You have Ellie Thomas sitting right here on the left. And if you look over on the right, you'll recognize Dr. Ira P. Davis. So he was still really closely tied with this effort. I believe that these are the 3 commanding white officers. There's probably a county commissioner over here on the left. This is I would assume is the opening of the Black Police Precinct. You see Ellie Thomas with 2 officers. Let's continue. So this is a pretty good photo of him. This is already, I think he was probably 86 at this time. He died at the age of 91 in 1989. So we'll continue. So if you were on for the virtual field trip a couple weeks ago, you would have seen the director, Timothy Barber, take you outside of Ellie Thomas's attorney's office. I think you can still see the shadow of where those letters were. And so this is just a photo of him a little bit later in his life. So I think I'm open to questions if anyone has any. I think one of the things that kind of struck me the most about my segment this week was learning about the bean field harvesting. So for those who joined in a little bit later, I am talking about Lawson Edward Thomas. I'm going to show you his photo once again. And so the bean field question was actually a case that he fought for. He sued the Broward County School Board because they had made the school year 3 months shorter for black children. And this was so they could be available as a labor source for bean field picking. So he fought against that, and he got them their full 9-month school year. But this was something that I learned about. This happened in Broward, and it happened in West Palm Beach. So I know that the education for black children, especially leading up to integration, was, I mean, we can even argue it till today, was never as good as for white children. But the fact that they would cut school to keep them as labor, I didn't know that. So that was one of the things that I learned doing this week. So hi Negus Beauty, thank you for joining. Hi Jocelyn, hi Mateo, hi Javo. I appreciate you guys for joining. So tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we have the virtual field trip with the director, Timothy Barber. And at 8 o'clock, we have the Lyric Live from the Living Room Edition, which happens at our Lyric Theater MIA handle. That's hosted by Cello and DJ H2. Super great event. And so, Mateo, for the people who came in late, I was talking about Ellie Thomas. He was the first black judge in the South since Reconstruction. He was the first black judge here in Miami. He was an instrumental member of what based for many movements here in Miami. So another one was the Haulover Beach Wade-in protest. So that was seen as the beginning of the civil rights movement here in Miami. He basically challenged the sheriff who told the protesters to get out of the water. And because of that incident, Charles Crandon called Thomas to basically set up to figure something out. And that directly led to the designation of Virginia Key Beach as a colored beach in 1945. Another thing that he did. Yeah, so that pretty much covers Lawson Thomas. Thank you guys for listening to me. I appreciate you coming back this week. So I actually have to share with you, in about 3 weeks, the Black Archives is going to be doing a Zoom panel presentation, which is called More Than a Hashtag, Preserving the Black Lives Matter Movement in the Digital Age. So this is the advertisement that on Wednesday, July 15th at 6:30. And we're going to have a couple guests. We're going to be joined by the director. We're going to have the archivists. All three of us are going to be talking about this. And we're basically going to talk about how we've preserved these movements in the past and what we're going to do going forward to keep this history and make sure that it's presented and be able to tell the story in a way that it should be told. So thank you guys for joining me. Stay safe. We are spiking. We have had record-breaking cases every single day. So please wear your mask. If you've been online, you've seen the people talking about the 5G and the deep state. And I mean, it's sad that people believe this stuff. And it's concerning because their lack of care for their own safety directly affects the rest of us. So please stay safe. Please. I hope everyone stay safe. I hope everyone's families are okay. I will see you guys next week. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye. Thank you, I am Black Beauty. Thank you, guys.